Yeah. Oh, yeah. Hello, everybody. Oh, good, it works. I wasn't sure. Welcome to today's seminar. Our speaker today is one of our very own in ocean studies. This is Dr. Justin Pratt, who has been here at MMA. He's actually in his second year here. He's an assistant professor of chemistry, and he's mostly teaching in the service courses for chemistry right now, but those of you moving into the DAS class in the spring, we'll be teaching that together, so you'll get a chance to meet him a little bit more. So before coming to MMA, Dr. Pratt got his bachelor's degree in chemistry and high school education at Southeast Missouri State University. He then got a PhD in chemistry education research at Miami University, which is not in Florida, it's in Ohio. Dr. Pratt has graduate certificates additionally in applied statistics and college teaching, and both of those inform his work as well. His research focuses on improving chemistry education, chemistry learning and teaching by harnessing a variety of qualitative and quantitative research methods. And today he's going to talk about a project that he worked on studying how well college students take the understanding and education of chemistry out into the community. With no further ado, Dr. Pratt.
Well, thank you. Yeah. So what I want to talk about today is a project from my dissertation, and where I talked about this idea of chemistry outreach. So it's a lot of times it's college students teaching chemistry to little kids or adults in their communities. And so that's what I wanted to investigate, is what do these college students think about doing outreach? Why are they doing it? Before we get to that, maybe you thought about working in the lab, because we do a lot of our teaching in the lab here. And so like a chemistry lab, research in a research laboratory, more like your senior research projects that some of you are in. Well, all of this is considered a formal learning environment. Learning that's taking in place where you're going to get a grade or there's some sort of formal aspect to it. But it's not the only place we learn science. There's a lot of places outside of school that we learn science, particularly in the media. So we've got like news articles can teach us about chemistry. The media, like the Magic School Bus, has some great lessons in there. If you haven't watched that, or the revamped version, I recommend. We've got video games. So this one is Minecraft teaching about catalysis. We've also got like museums and zoos, these cultural institutions where you purposely go to learn something about science. And then what's near and dear to my heart as a chemist is chemistry outreach. And this typically looks like demonstration shows, so a crowd, an audience, and someone doing like an explosion or something like that, something cool and exciting. And so that's where I wanted to focus my work, is within this outside of the classroom, informal environment. And so this is a wonderful representation of learning across your lifespan. And so if you look at the axis down here, we've got your grade in school. And so if we think about K through 12, your normal traditional learning, only about 19% of your learning actually happens in a classroom. And now look at you as college students. It's way less. Most of your learning is outside the classroom in these informal environments. And so because most of our learning is there, trying to understand what we're doing and how to improve that learning is really important. And that's where my research is focused on, is all of this outside of the classroom learning. And so there's kind of 4 groupings or categories of these informal science locations for learning. We can talk about your everyday experiences, so just making observations in your real life, going out to the ocean and seeing something, that's your learning. But then we've got the media, the institutions, and then where chemistry outreach really comes into play is this structured out-of-school time programs. These are places where they purposely go to learn, maybe in elementary school, after school, to do activities with kids. So it's extracurricular. It's not part of the formal environment, but it's happening after school in some fashion. And so when I talk about this chemistry outreach idea, typically what we do as scientists is we go and look at the literature. What's been out there? What's already been done in this field before you want to design a study? Well, when you go and look at the field in the literature for chemistry outreach, unfortunately, there's really not much out there. If you go look at it, you get a lot of demonstration or magic show ideas, a lot of procedures on how to do an experiment. Nothing about, did the kids learn at the event? What did the college student gain as a part of doing that experience? The other types of literature out there are how to structure maybe a summer camp in science. That's not really chemistry outreach. And then there's one group, Fusion Science Theater. They're the first group that's really looked at chemistry outreach and said, hey, we could actually study this and make it good, but they're one group, one publication in the entire literature about studying chemistry outreach. So it's a really right place for us to study, and that's where I wanted to start my work. But once again, I didn't have literature to go off of to develop this study. So we kind of went in blind. And so we chose to focus on organizations that do chemistry outreach. And so there's two national chemistry organizations. There's the American Chemical Society, so they have student groups at individual institutions. And then there's Alpha Chi Sigma, which is a professional chemistry fraternity. They also have chapters at individual institutions. And so we chose these as our focus in our study population because of this fact right here. These two groups report reaching about 1 million people every year in their outreach. So they're doing a ton of outreach, but once again, we're not really understanding what they're doing. Is there any impact on these millions of people they're reaching? And so that's this hole in the literature we were trying to understand. And so if we look at what these organizations do, they provide a lot of funding and resources to do outreach. So you can go to the American Chemical Society's website, and they provide resources and experiments, particularly for National Chemistry Week, which is later in October, so those of you currently in chemistry, get excited. Also for Chemists Celebrate Earth Day, that's another time of the year that they celebrate and give a lot of resources. But once again, a lot of time and energy is being put into outreach without really understanding, is it worth it? And so our first look at this, we have this metaphor of we were really dipping our toes into this water for the first time. No one's really studied outreach. And so without literature to go off of, we decided to collect some open-ended data to give us information about what are these groups doing so we can try to design a formal study. And so what we asked are these 3 research questions. We wanted to understand these people that are doing outreach. What's their goal or purpose for doing it? Why do they think it's important and a valued experience to reach 1 million people every year? What activities are they doing? Could we identify common activities multiple groups or schools are using? And then how are they evaluating themselves? If they say a purpose is about learning, how do they know the kids actually learned at that event? So kind of a feedback loop into what they're planning on doing at an outreach event. So how do we go about this? Well, we didn't have literature, so we collected data. And so we used Qualtrics, which is a survey software, to ask some open-ended responses of these participants. And so, as I said, our 3 main research questions were, one was about purpose, so here's some example questions we asked them, just really open-ended. So what is the purpose of outreach? What do you think the value is for doing outreach? Similar questions about what activities do you use? What do your events look like? And similarly about evaluation. How do they evaluate their events? So these are open-ended questions, so these were short answers that all of our participants answered, and then we had to analyze and interpret that data. And this is who it went to. So it went to over 1,000 chapters of the ACS, so that's 1,000 different institutions, and about 92 or so chapters of the Alpha Chi Sigma fraternity. So we had a lot of institutions represented in this, and so how many responses did we actually get? We ended with 206 responses. So if you're at all familiar with education research, that's a good number. We broke 100. Hey, okay? But let's look at where they are. So we've got demographics based on their locations, and so you can see they're spread across the country, but ACS is an international organization. So we also have some international representation here from international schools. We have a mixture of ACS and Alpha Chi Sigma as their identified group. The fact that ACS is 61% isn't surprising because ACS is a much larger organization, 1,000 chapters versus 100. Okay, it's a lot bigger. And then you can look at their years of experience doing outreach. So we had a range, some people that are brand new to doing outreach and some people that have been doing it for over a decade. And so we have a good wide range of experiences represented in this. And so what kind of results did we find? And so these were open-ended questions. This is a qualitative research study. I'm trying to understand their written responses. So the method we use for this, it's called constant comparative analysis. And codes and themes emerge from the data. These are just fancy terms for the methods we use. So I want to give you an example of what this looks like, since most of you have never experienced qualitative data before. And so here are two responses from our participants related to the question, what's the purpose of doing outreach? And so I see these two responses as being very similar. One's about education, one's about learning. They're all together talking about some sort of learning idea. And so what I would do is lump them together in a group and call that some sort of audience learning goal. And so that's this idea of the codes and themes emerge from the data. I picked learning because it shows up in the responses. And so I'm grouping these together, trying to simplify my data set in some way by finding similarities. And then we use constant comparative analysis. That's really just compare and contrast. How are my new responses similar or different than what I just looked at? Should these responses be included in this category or not? And if you look at these example responses, they're definitely a different idea. They're not about learning anymore. It's something about having fun and being excited about chemistry. So that would be called a different purpose, such as awareness that science is fun. And so this is a process you go through. It's very iterative. So reading these 206 responses probably 5 different times, okay, to come up with these final decisions. And so in the end, these are just more examples of what these look like. We're grouping these ideas together. And so what we could find is 8 unique purposes that these 206 participants expressed about doing outreach. And I've ordered them from most prevalent in the sample to least prevalent in the sample. And so just take a second and look at that data. Anyone want to yell out something they see in the data? Here's something I see. Look at that first one, the most prevalent idea. It's kind of an outlier. We go from 60% to 40% as the next idea. So we're really seeing this audience learning idea standing out from the rest of the ideas. The rest are kind of lumped together where the similar quantities or numbers of students represented that idea. But audience learning is really standing out. And so that's a key finding for us, is that college students are approaching outreach where they want the kids to learn at the event. That's a key finding for us. Our second research question was, what are the activities that they're doing? Is there any common ones that we can find? So the approach we took with this is a word cloud. So if you're not familiar with these, you literally dump all the data together and it counts the number of times each word appears. So if it appears a bunch, it's bigger in the word cloud. So in this case, demonstrations came up much more than any other word in the data. But demonstrations isn't a meaningful term for me because all of these can be called demonstrations. So let's remove that as an outlier. And we can get some more precision in our ability to look at these data. And so what calls out to me are these 3 different activities. I'm seeing slime, liquid nitrogen ice cream, and elephant toothpaste. So these are 3 common demonstrations that if you've ever done outreach, you're familiar with. But most of you probably haven't, and you have no idea what I'm talking about. So let's talk about it. Slime. You make slime. It's this gross, gooey thing. The kids usually get really dirty, and they get to take it home, and then the parents are upset because you gave them this gooey thing that now goes home with them. Elephant toothpaste is really flashy and messy. It's exciting. It gets really hot. And then liquid nitrogen ice cream, not only does it look cool, but then the kids get to eat something at the end of the activity. Okay? So that's really exciting, flashy activities that are happening. But remember, their main goal was audience learning. So there needs to be some rich ideas in here for them to learn. Well, it turns out there are. If we talk about slime, it's all about polymers, this topic called dynamic covalent chemistry. Yeah, I've never heard of it too. It's okay. But there's some rich chemistry there. Elephant toothpaste is all about thermodynamics, kinetics. It's got some oxidation reduction in there. So there's a lot of chemistry just involved with elephant toothpaste. And then if we talk about liquid nitrogen ice cream, We've got phase changes, we've got some thermo ideas with heat transfer, we've got particulate nature of matter ideas. So some rich chemistry in here. If their goal is audience learning, they're ripe to do that, okay? But let's look at what they actually do. So when I ask them, how do you evaluate yourself? How do you know if you've reached your purpose of audience learning? These are the responses. Yeah, it's really shallow. The kids smiled at me, so therefore they learned something. Okay, I told them, that's my favorite one. Well, I just told them, so therefore they must have learned it because I told them. We all know as students that just because the instructor said it doesn't mean you got it, right? So they really fall flat here. They have all of these really great ideas and purposes behind them, but then the way they think about it and evaluate themselves really isn't happening. And so in a summary of these findings, we see that they have a lot of purposes, some sort of cognitive, like learning, and some sort of affective, some sort of emotional component, seeing that they can be a scientist, or seeing that science isn't scary. They have really diverse chemistry content, but really shallow evidence of any sort of outcomes at their event. And so this, instead of looking at literature to design a study, this data was what we used to design a study. And so all of this fed into some unanswered questions that we dove into really in depth. And so if audience learning is one of their goals, well, one of our questions was, well, how accurate and in-depth is the college student's understanding of chemistry, since they're going to teach that to a kid? If they're teaching multiple types of audiences, so a second grader is different than a high school student, how do they change their explanations to fit that audience? Because what I say to a second grader definitely should be different than what I say to you as college students. And then, how are they trained to become some sort of teacher in an outreach setting? What sort of experiences do they go through? So I investigated all of these ideas, but for today, we're just going to zoom in on the first one. How accurate and in-depth is their content knowledge? And so as an education researcher, we turn to theory a lot to help us think about what we should study and why are we studying certain ideas. So why are we studying content knowledge for these outreach practitioners? And so the theory we turn to is called pedagogical content knowledge. Fancy phrase. All it means is, for you to be a good teacher, you need to know your discipline, and you also need to know how to teach. And you need to merge that together. That's all it means. And so some people talk about your discipline in terms of like science versus history. Some people go more fine grain and differentiate chemistry from biology, from oceanography. And some people dive in even deeper and do it by topic. So equilibrium's different than kinetics. Regardless of your perspective on this, the idea is someone that's a teacher better know the content to be an effective teacher. That's the idea here. So this applies to outreach because these college students are teaching. So they need to have good content knowledge if they're going to be successful. And so exploring that idea as part of this study was our goal. And so the method we used isn't really that novel anymore. We've all gotten really comfortable with Zoom, chatting with people, video and audio communication. Back when I did the study, Zoom didn't exist. Okay? Skype was the way to go. So this was a really novel thing back in the day to interview people on Skype or Zoom, because normally you want to interview them in person. So this was really novel like 5 years ago, and now it's not. But we developed this approach to be able to collect the type of data we would get if I could speak to you in person, but online. And so we used a lot of different tools here that I'm going to dive into, but what's really key is we tried to model the in-person experience. So if you give an interview with someone, you give them materials to look at. We were able to use instant messaging, email, and survey software to give them information to look at. So we were able to model what you can do in person online. Now, we're all used to that. This isn't really that cool anymore, but that's how we collected this data, because we didn't want to interview a college student from one chapter at one institution. I wanted to understand the national scale of what outreach looks like. So I wanted to interview people from across the country. And so our interviews were really long, 60 to 120 minutes, really long interviews. They averaged about an hour and a half. And so what happens is you do an interview, we're talking audio, we're using visuals, and then as a researcher, I take all of that and convert it just to text. So we transcribe it verbatim, and that is now my data, a transcribed interview. It basically is like a book, okay, line by line of what everyone said, and that's what we analyzed. The format of the interview had 4 main phases that aligned with our unanswered questions. And so these 3 phases line up with what I presented earlier. But this is a new sample. We got new people. So we wanted to verify, are the people we're interviewing here similar to those people that did that survey? So do they also agree that teaching and outreach is their goal? Because if they don't agree with that, then why am I asking them about content knowledge? So because this is a new population that we studied, we had to change that and re-ask them. And luckily, they do agree with us. But let's look at how we get this. Oh, that projector's not pretty, is it? So turns out when you want to interview people and you don't get to walk up to them and introduce yourself and say, hey, my name's Justin, I'd like to talk to you about outreach. Turns out they don't really want to participate when they just get an email from a stranger saying, hey, I want to interview. Okay? So what happened was we had to be very flexible in our ability to get people to want to be in our study, because all they got was a cold call, not phone call, cold email from me saying, hey, I know you do outreach. Can we talk? And I'm just this random stranger. So we had this multi-tiered approach where we handed out flyers at a national meeting. I handed out 250 flyers. Look how successful. A whole 5 people. Yeah. Education research is hard because getting people to participate is the hard part. It's the challenge. So we took a lot of different approaches here that I'm not going to dive into, but in the end, we had 37 people that participated in this interview. So 37 people times an hour and a half interview apiece. It was a lot of my time talking to people about outreach. And so where did they come from? We can talk about their demographics by institution or where their club was from. And so it's across the country, so we had good representation of geographical distances. We can compare the size of the schools, so we had some really large research-intensive institutions, as well as really small schools like MMA. We can also look at public and private, but in the end, it was 22 unique universities, so 22 unique student chapters of one of those organizations is who we were able to talk to. But looking at their school isn't as informative as looking at who the people actually were. And so we can look at their identified gender, and so we see roughly a 50-50 split here in our sample, so we have some diversity there. We can look at their year in school. So a range from second-year sophomores all the way to chemistry graduate students participated in this. But what I want you to zoom in on is most of our sample were juniors and seniors in chemistry. They are about to graduate with chemistry degrees. That's really important for us to remember. And then look at their majors. Most were chemistry or biochemistry, but these organizations, the only requirement to join them is you like science. So we have some non-chemistry majors, so that's where our biology majors show up. We also have non-science. There was a computer science and a history major who just like science enough to want to do these outreach activities. So they're represented in our sample. And then here's how I know that this sample had similar ideas as that national survey. Of the 37, 31 agreed that, yeah, teaching kids chemical concepts is what a goal of outreach is. And then the ways they evaluate themselves is if the kids learned or they gave a good explanation. So even though this is a different sample of students, they still have similar ideas. And so investigating their content knowledge is still crucial here since they agree that learning is part of their goals for outreach. And so we asked them about 2 main activities, the elephant toothpaste reaction and liquid nitrogen ice cream. So we're going to go through each of these. So we're going to start with elephant toothpaste. Now, most of you probably have no idea what elephant toothpaste is. Raise your hand if you have no idea what I'm talking about. Perfect. Okay. So elephant toothpaste is a common demonstration we do. You take 30% hydrogen peroxide. So that's not the peroxide you can buy at the store. You mix it with a catalyst. Typically, it's some sort of iodide salt. We add dish soap to make it foam. And sometimes we put food coloring in to make it pretty. That's the whole demo. But let's watch it. So in their flask here, they've already got peroxide, dish soap, and some food coloring, and now they're just going to pour in their iodide salt. Very flashy. It shoots out of their reaction vessels, it gets on the ceiling, it's steaming, so it's really hot, exothermic. It's messy, it's falling from the ceiling, and I think it'll show us it stuck to the ceiling too. So it's really messy, it's really flashy, it's hot, it's exciting. And so that's the demo we're going to talk about, is this reaction of hydrogen peroxide with a catalyst. But why do we call it elephant toothpaste if it's hydrogen peroxide and a catalyst? Well, let's talk about Bruno. This is what most college students in these organizations use as I'm going to put it in quotes, context. Okay? They say they've got an elephant named Bruno, and he's eating a ton of onions, and so that means he needs to brush his teeth. But of course, toothpaste is expensive, so we're just going to make some. And so that's the context some of these organizations put on this demonstration. Okay? That we have some elephant, and because it seems to shoot out of our graduated cylinder here like toothpaste comes out of a tube, therefore it's elephant toothpaste. The name literally has no connection to the reaction. I got nothing. But we can just blame it on Bruno. So we did a pilot study, and so we were trying to understand, could we get the type of data we wanted? And so in our pilot study, I just asked the participants, what chemicals go into elephant toothpaste? So there was a requirement that they had done the activity before I asked them about it. So every single person we talked to has done elephant toothpaste with children. But look at our responses. So this is Lois. That's a fake name, by the way. It's not her real name. She was a senior chemistry major. And she said, well, I don't remember, but I believe it's an acid-base reaction. I'm going to tell you that's wrong. And you put soap in it. So she doesn't know the chemicals that go into it, but she thinks it's acid-base. I asked her more about something about it expanding, and she continued to this acid-base idea, but then got a little confused. She's like, well, if it's neutralizing, that means water and a salt. So if you've been through Professor Friedman's chemistry class, you should know that acid-base neutralization makes water and salt. Where does the gas come from? So Lois got a little confused and was like, hey, some gas could be made, cool. And she was fine with it. But she couldn't really tell me what goes into it, so I couldn't really dive in deeper to know if she understands it, because she couldn't even tell me the chemicals involved. Similar results here about the heat. So it steams, it gets really hot. And we want to know, where's that heat coming from? How does it get hot? And these are the common responses, that it's coming from the bonds or the bonds breaking. That is an inaccurate idea. And if you're familiar at all with the education literature, this is a prevalent misunderstanding that students have. That when you break a bond, suddenly energy is released. And that's why the heat gets hot. Just think about it. If bonds release energy, why do I have to put energy in to break it? They don't just break on their own. So this is a wrong idea, but the fact that we found it isn't shocking, because this has been in the research literature for us since the 90s. So we know this is a common misunderstanding, and seeing it in our data set isn't surprising, it's just unfortunate. But then here's where we really struggled. Just trying to get them to tell me what is mixed together to do the reaction. Because I can't ask them if they know what a catalyst is if they don't even know there's a catalyst involved. And so this is what happened. I asked them, and I really couldn't get much detail. So we couldn't answer our research question because I couldn't get the data we needed. And so we had to change our method. And so our chemistry content phase of the interview, similar with our communication section, had to change. And so when we did our full study, we learned from the pilot study that just asking the students what chemicals are involved doesn't work. So we changed it. We kept the original, just asking them, but then we added in a new task. It's called a critique explanation. And so this is another way for us to elicit the data we wanted to be able to address our research questions. So what did that look like? So I told the students in the interview that we received a lot of different explanations, and they have a mixture of accurate and inaccurate ideas. So I told my participants, I'm going to send you something that has right and wrong ideas in it. I was upfront about it, and I wanted them to go line by line and tell me, is each line chemically correct or not? So I told them there's wrong stuff in here, and the task was see if they could identify it. So what I'm going to do is give you a chance to experience what my participants experienced. So I know none of you are chemistry majors, but what this prompt is going to be is for someone who's had general chemistry, so the 1-year sequence that Professor Friedman teaches. Okay, some of you are currently in that course. It's all good. Some of you have completed that course. So I'm going to give you the prompt, and I'm going to ask you to read through it, and anytime you find something wrong, make a sound. stomp your foot, snap a finger, clap your hands, bang on the desk. Make an audible noise that you found something wrong. Okay? Any questions? Ready, go. Okay, who's overwhelmed? Yeah, these are big chemistry words. So in the interview, I left the participants hanging. They didn't know. I'm going to give you the right answers. Everything bold and red is inaccurate, wrong chemistry. So there was a lot of wrong stuff in here. And I just wanted to see, will they find it? If they know the chemistry, it should scream out to them, something's funky about that statement. But why did I pick these wrong ideas? Of all the ideas, why did I pick them? And so some of those ideas came from our pilot study. So that idea that this is an acid-base reaction from Lois, that's right up here. Another person also told us that it made hydrogen gas. So we kept that, we learned from our pilot study. The other ideas came from the research literature. So in blue here, this idea is of exothermic bond breaking. That's something we know from the research literature, so we put it in there. Similar with this idea about activation energy. But then what about the purple? Our goal for that was, well, I told them there was wrong stuff in the explanation. So our goal with purple was to be so wrong that if they only saw one thing wrong in the whole statement, they'd see the purple. That was our whole goal. So the fact that soap is breaking bonds, the fact that a catalyst changes enthalpy, those should scream out to anyone that's been through a one-year chemistry course, something's funky. Even if you don't know what's wrong about it, something's funky. So we asked the participants to analyze this line by line, so that's how we interpreted their responses. So if I take the original explanation and break it into lines, I have 11 statements I can analyze. And to make it easier, we're going to subdivide those into, oh man, everything that's wrong should be grayed out right now. That's how great the projector is. We're going to analyze them by statements that have wrong chemistry and statements that have correct chemistry. And so here's a graph, and I'm going to walk you through how to interpret this. So we are talking about chemically correct statements. So they are accurate chemistry ideas, and we're categorizing how the student responded. So if they said, yes, the chemistry is correct, it is green and on the right side here, it is a positive finding that they saw the chemistry is correct. If they said it was wrong though, even though it is correct, it's on the left here in red, a negative finding. The student has some misunderstanding. Now, as much as I asked them to comment on every line, we're notorious as humans to not follow instructions. So we have some that didn't comment on the accuracy. So they are gray dots here in the middle to represent them. And so what I want you to see is there's lots of green here. Students did pretty well with these chemically accurate statements. But then we look at the inaccurate statements. So the color coding is opposite. These are chemically inaccurate ideas. So if they thought it was correct chemistry, even though it's wrong, it's on the right here, but it's in red now, a negative finding. They have a misunderstanding. And then green here means they understood that the chemistry was wrong, so it's a positive finding. And then once again, those gray dots in the middle. So let's go through and look at some of these examples so you can see what do these students say when they read these individual statements. So let's start with statement 5. This is a chemically correct statement. So here's the statement, and it's about how the catalyst changes the reaction rate by changing the mechanism. Okay, that is a chemically correct idea. And we've got Marina here, a senior chemistry student, who said, yeah, that's correct. And I'd say that to a Gen Chem student. So she understood that the chemistry is accurate. Here's Carrie. And I'll just give you a second to read Carrie's response. And so what we see in Carrie's response is something that I teach, that a catalyst is conserved, it is recovered in a reaction. But Carrie's not recognizing that it can change the mechanism, and that's how the reaction rate actually changes. That's how we change activation energy. The pathway changes. And so Carrie's not understanding that. And she's a sophomore. She just finished freshman chemistry, and she has this misunderstanding. Let's zoom into option 10 here. It's about a 50-50 split between getting it right and getting it wrong. And the statement is once again about a catalyst, but now it's about how the catalyst gets converted to an intermediate as part of that mechanism changing. So the catalyst changes, and then it's recovered in the end. And so we've got Gwen here, a senior, who understood that. Yeah, that makes sense. The catalyst may be involved in an intermediate, but it's produced again at the end. So understanding the relationship between activation energy, catalysis, and a mechanism. But then Sue, a senior chemistry, or not chemistry, just a science major, said, well, catalysts don't change, so that's super wrong. So this misunderstanding where they're making this they're putting their foot down, well, catalysts can't change. But not understanding why catalysts work then, they're not understanding the full chemistry of it. Let's look at some inaccurate statements. So the first statement, the only inaccuracy is about the products made in the reaction. Instead of making water and hydrogen gas, it makes water and oxygen gas. And so we've got Vance here, a senior chemistry major, who understood that. He's pretty sure it decomposes into water and oxygen, so yeah, I would change that to fix this statement. But then Steve here is like, I have no problem with the first one, I think that's excellent. And so just think about this. Hydrogen is an explosive gas. This is an exothermic reaction that gets really hot. If it made hydrogen gas, there's a chance it would explode. It doesn't do that. So connecting what you physically do in the activity to the chemistry, Steve hasn't done that. Statement 3 here, this is the worst one of them all. And it is that exothermic bond breaking idea that we found in the literature, that it's disappointing to see in the sample, but not surprising. And so you got Carrie here, who knew that's wrong, making this connection that, well, bond breaking takes energy. It should never be exothermic. Great, warms my heart. And then Helena, well, that sounds good to me. It talks about heat is stored inside the bonds, and when those bonds are broken, heat is released. So that is the stereotypical response of a student that doesn't understand how bonds work. And that's what we see in the literature, this misconnection between energy, heat, and a bond. And that is representative of most of our sample. So remember, these are mostly juniors and seniors about to graduate with a chemistry degree, not understanding this very basic concept from freshman chemistry. Look at statement 7 here. This one's completely inaccurate. Completely. It's about the catalyst changing enthalpy. So this is one of those, if they only saw one really, really wrong one, hopefully it was this one. Bruce was a chemistry graduate student, so he got it. Great for him. He knows this is inaccurate because a catalyst shouldn't do that. It just changes the amount of energy you need. So he's relating this idea of activation energy as opposed to enthalpy. Great. Totally awesome. But then Johnny here, a junior chemistry major, was like, I can see that. It decreases enthalpy because the activation energy is lowered. So for most of you, that probably just sounds like big words. For anyone that's a chemist, that's like so wrong. It like hurts my soul. Okay? Hurts my soul. And so the fact that we're seeing this is really unfortunate because these students, remember, they're teaching in outreach. And they really don't even understand the reactions they're doing, but now they're with kids and doing science with kids and teaching them science, but not really understanding it. And so this is a summary of those findings. Now for the sake of time, because we need to wrap up pretty soon, I'm going to skip through the liquid nitrogen prompt. It's a lot easier, and I want you to just look at the data for a second and see that they did a lot better on the correct statements for liquid nitrogen, but not so bueno on the wrong statements. It's like a 50-50 split. It's like it's all random. So they still didn't understand even the liquid nitrogen ice cream, which they get to eat at the end. But what I want to talk about are these gray dots. What does it mean when a student didn't comment on the accuracy? They read the statement. I was in the interview with them. I watched them read it out loud to me, but they didn't comment. What does that mean? Does it mean they understand the chemistry, or does it mean they don't? And so this is, once again, as an education researcher, we turn to theory to help us interpret this finding. And so the theory we used is called the theory of meaningful learning, and it differentiates two different types of learning. We've got rote learning and meaningful. Rote learning is where you basically memorize isolated facts. So that's why all of these are not connected into a complex web. They are isolated facts. But when you learn meaningfully, you construct a model with all of these interactions and connections between ideas. And so it's a lot more complex as a mental image of way you construct your knowledge. And so if a student read a prompt, one of these incorrect ideas, if they had learned meaningfully, theoretically, it should pull one of these connections that they have. They should read it and go, something's wrong about that. I might not know what it is, but something's funky. It should prime or make one of these connections leap in their brain. But if they don't have those meaningful connections and they're all isolated facts, if they just read one, it's not going to be able to prime anything else in their mental model and what they think. And so one way we can interpret these gray dots is that the students had memorized some facts and they didn't really meaningfully understand the material. But that's me making a conjecture. I'm trying to interpret these responses. Well, luckily, we have quotes from the students that help support that interpretation. So here's Nina, a junior chemistry student, and she's reading one of the prompts from liquid nitrogen ice cream that says, and I'll just tell you right now, London dispersion forces are the strongest intermolecular force. If you've ever been in chemistry, that is completely wrong. It's the opposite. It's the weakest. So she's trying to understand why that statement was wrong. She's like, well, London dispersion's actually the weakest, I think. But to be honest, I don't even understand why London dispersion's a thing. I just know that it increases when the molecules are bigger and slower, but I still don't know how it happens. So Nina's admitting that she memorized London dispersion's the weakest, and it increases when they get bigger. But she has no connection to why London dispersion's a thing. So nothing about an electron cloud, nothing about a distribution or charges, nothing like that. She just knows these facts. And so this quote, along with this theory, helps us interpret these responses as students that memorized their chemistry and didn't really conceptually understand the material. And so what does this mean? So let's look through these conclusions. What we found was a lot of misconceptions and misunderstandings. Okay? And they really are concerning because these students had done these demos before. They've done them with children. And yet now they can't tell me what chemicals react together, and their explanations are completely wrong. So these are the key areas where they struggled, just even knowing the products of the reaction. Think about this from a safety standpoint. These college students go off to an elementary school and work with kids, with chemicals. They don't even know the products of the reactions they're doing with the children. So think about from a chemical safety standpoint. No bueno, not a great time, right? I wouldn't want those students teaching my kids if they don't even know that they're making water at the end, right? It's a concern there. It also shows us that they have these beliefs about teaching. They want the students to learn at these events, right? But there's really a disconnect between what they're doing, how they're interpreting their evaluation of that, and how it gets implemented. And so it poses some concerns here about how good is the outreach these little kids are going to. If the college students don't understand it, what are they telling the kids? Is it accurate? Is it inaccurate? I don't know. So there's some concerns here about what actually is happening at these events with our little children. And so as an education researcher, we always think about what do these findings tell us for teaching? And so we can think about the formal classrooms, that's like teaching here right now, and we can also think about the informal environment back to outreach. And so for the formal environment, what we found was there's all of these misconceptions and misunderstandings. But the faculty don't necessarily know that. If you're not reading the education literature that I'm in, you have no idea that these are out there, that we know that there are certain topics that students just struggle with. And so we really need to disseminate that more and get more faculty involved in reading the literature outside of their discipline so they understand more about what's already out there for teaching. And in terms of outreach, well, we know that educators with misconceptions pass them on to their students. If you don't understand it, there's no way you're going to teach someone it correctly. And so the fact that this is happening, what are the kids actually learning at these events? If their goal is audience learning, but they can't explain it, what's actually happening? How is that being put into place? And so this really calls for some professional development to help train these students to be better teachers, to think more holistically about their events and aligning their goal with what they actually do. But one of our other findings was that all of these are student organizations, so they are required to have a faculty advisor to support them. Every single person I talked to told me the faculty advisor is not involved. They are a figurehead to be allowed to have the organization. They are not involved in any decision-making about outreach. So these college students are really going out blind. They have no real support system, no real training, no expertise in it. They just want to do it because it's fun, and the kids get to have a good time. So they have these really nice, beneficial ideas. It's just now we need to focus on making that more purposeful to make these events better. And so before I stop, I always have to make some acknowledgments. I have to thank the people that we interviewed, because without these people, we wouldn't have any data. I also have to thank the 2 organizations that allowed us to have access to their students. Without those national organizations, I couldn't get any data at all. And then as an education researcher, one of our goals is we need outside perspective, right? We're analyzing quotes. How do I know my analysis is accurate or trustworthy? So we get feedback from other people, and so thanking those research groups that gave us feedback on our interpretations. And with that, I would be happy to take any questions you have.
I'm the roving microphone. Okay, let's see. I'm going to go to Bree, and then I'm going to go to India, and then over in the corner.
Nice talk. Thank you, Professor Pratt. My question is that do you think that your data would be different if you were able to access more students involved in outreach? Do you think it would look a lot different, or?
There's only one.
Maybe you can come along.
So that's a great question. So the concern about if we got more people, would the data change? And the answer is I don't know, most likely. But what I will tell you is there's a lot of considerations built into how we analyze this data, because it's qualitative. So getting a lot of outside input to make sure other people agree with our consensus. And so I didn't have time to go over that, but there's like 12 different things we did to make sure that our interpretations are accurate and supported by other people. But you're right, if we got more people, the data could change. And that's the limitation of education research. You're stuck with people. People aren't consistent, and sometimes they don't want to participate, and that has an impact on your data.
And my second question was in regards to your overall experiment. This is just in terms of like teaching chemistry for kids. Like, could this apply to like adults maybe, or even other college students who probably struggle with chemistry?
Yeah, so when people do these outreach events, they do it for all sorts of audiences. So second graders, middle schoolers, high schoolers, college students, parents, community members. So some of these college groups just host a table outside and see who walks up. So you have a range of people that can show up at these events. And so that's why one of our focuses was asking, how do they do that adjustment? So I didn't present that data, but we asked them, how do they make those decisions? What do you say to a parent as opposed to a middle schooler? It should be different. And so I have a paper, if you want to learn more about that, I can send it to you. But we did investigate that.
Hello. Do you have what was your motivation to look into this topic of outreach chemistry? Do you have a personal experience that motivated you to get into this?
He can only.
Yeah, when I was an undergrad, I did chemistry outreach almost every week. Every weekend I was at a kids museum doing demonstrations, and I was a president of one of my organizations that we studied, so I had direct experience with this, and so I had that personal motivation because I was interested in it. I did outreach, but I had never thought about why were we doing it. We just did it because it was fun, and the kids liked it, right? And so I had that exact personal buy-in that these people had, just now a different perspective.
I didn't see, was it Kate? Yeah.
I was wondering when you talked about the rote versus meaningful learning, where you think that is instilled in these students, like where that begins. Do you think if it has anything to do with our education system growing up and how a lot of times in schools we're expected to just memorize facts and that's how we get used to taking tests? And I was also wondering if you came across anybody who was able to remember what the reactions were, what goes into it, or if that was like 100% of your sample.
Yeah. So first, we definitely had people that knew what they were doing. So if I could show the graphs again, there was a lot of green. And so there was a couple people that had green on every statement. So they knew what they were doing. But it's definitely an outlier. It was only like maybe 10% of the sample could do the whole thing. Otherwise, it was mostly maybe they just had one misunderstanding, because all of us aren't perfect. We don't have our perfect chemistry skills after 1 year, right? I've been doing chemistry for 10 years. So it's a very different experience. But in terms of your question about meaningful learning and the education system, I mean, I think you hit it on the head. A lot of your K through 12 experiences typically focused on memorizing facts or regurgitating some facts. You weren't asked to make meaningful connections, a lot of whys and how things happen. You weren't asked to make connections between chemistry and biology, to make those meaningful connections. And so it comes down to how we structure the classroom, and a lot of faculty aren't trained in education, so they don't even know that this exists. So they're coming into the classroom really with just their own experiences as a student and as a TA maybe in graduate school. So their perspectives on teaching are all born out of experience, not necessarily any formal training on it. And so it comes down to how we train the teacher to structure the learning environment.
So we're at 4 o'clock, so if people have practice and other things that they need to get to, that's great, but I'm sure Dr. Pratt would say, if you want to come ask questions, just come on down closer where we don't have to use the microphone.